Okay, so this week we're going to talk about mostly Windows forensic. And in some school, the actual Windows forensic is its own course. But we want to get a little bit in depth in when you're looking at an image that is a Windows system, what should you do, right? Um, so as you know that Microsoft owns, or most business use Microsoft product, mostly because they use Exchange or Microsoft Exchange for email. And for the productivity software, they would refer to your Office suite, right? Like right now, I think it's at 365, but you also have other variation like 2024 and so on. But when we're looking at the operating system, we have to kind of understand a little bit about where everything is. So in the case, if you are searching for settings or user information, you will be able to find it. Um, so so the first question that asks you in Windows 7 and Windows 10, where can you locate your user account? So your user account profile, right? So when the account is created on that local system, it will be under the C, right? Username under the users. And we see this when you navigate into look at your documents. So that profile would contain documents. It would contain whatever the user downloads or picture unless it's modified, right? So by default, you would be able to find the account name, right? So if I'm logged on as John Doe, then John Doe would be under the users folder. So you would be able to find it. Now, by regulation, you're not allowed to look at other profile if there's court order for a specific account. So you would only do it within your scope. So if I'm searching for information for John Doe, right? And I would have the court order to be able to do that, even though there are other accounts on the system, you cannot inspect other accounts. So that's important to know. So there are multiple types of user accounts, and you can find this on the notes. One, you have the local user profile, which is stored onto that local system. So if I'm looking at that Windows PC or that laptop, right? Sometime it could be a Surface tablet. That will be the account that was created on that physical system. Some of the accounts can be network accounts, and in Windows environment, you can create roaming user accounts for the people who are able to use many different systems in the network. So for example, I might have a manager at a bank, and this person would be able to travel from one location to another to be able to do audit or whatnot, right? So I would be able to create him or her or them as a roaming user. So the local user, this profile contains all the activities that pertain to that particular account on that physical system. So when they log in, right, it automatically sets up the profile information, but we have to manually create that. So, and you can do that through control panel or computer management console users folder. But once that account is created, even in the installation setup, right, it will be specific to that user and it's stored only on that computer. Right. So when you do the forensic, you just got to make sure that you capture the image of that system. So for example, right, you are logged on to this classroom PC. I would be able to investigate your account, right, if I'm permitted to, because your information is stored on this PC. The same thing with mine on the front PC over here. Now, the roaming user account, this is when your network administrator create the account. It is a network type of an account. So that means that the profile needs to be pulled from the server. So the server would store this account because we create the account in Active Directory in Windows Server environment. So Active Directory is a database that contains objects like computers, right? Systems, and then also subject like users and also groups. So what you have is you would have these profiles that is stored on the server. And whenever the user logs into computer A, right, at a location, it's going to connect to the server and be able to pull. So as soon as the user logs in successfully, right, those of you who took security and IT, you know this, it pulls the security agent, it pulls the permissions, all the privileges, everything that relates to that user account and store it on the local system. So it's loaded to the actual physical system A, right, once they're logged in. And if there is any kind of changes made, it's going to update the server. So it syncs back into the server. So for example, I'm able to change my desktop background, or I added some desktop icons. At that point, right, at some point in the day, my system A is going to then sync back into the server. So the forensic part for the roaming user profile is kind of nice because you can look at the local host, which is the system that they're using, along with the server that stores their profile information. So that's the main difference, is it's in two places, right? It starts at the network server and then it pulls the information down and store it on the local system. Then it updates it. You can also change it from the server and it's going to update the local system as well. So if I want the user to be able to access other things like applications, or network drives, I can modify the roaming profile and be able to do that. So for those of you who are going to go into IT sometime, that you have to manage the roaming profile. But when you do forensic, just keep in mind that you have an image that is a local host, and then you can also pull their profile from the server itself. Then you have the mandatory user profile, which is created also by your network administrator. And it would have specific settings. So some administrator, they only want the user to have certain application or icon. So for example, right, you go to Coinstar and you have this application that overlays a Windows system. You know it's a Windows system, right? And so you only have a start button, right? And so that way you can deposit your coins. So in that case, they create, right, an actual mandatory account, a user profile. And that person does, and the customer doesn't have to log in. As long as they press start, it's going to run the application no matter what. But the mandatory profile can also contain specific things, right? Like desktop icons, links to certain drives, or even connection. So in this case, it's going to load the specific settings from the network, right, onto the host, kind of similar to the roaming. But in order to change, the administrator or the at the network level, whoever the highest privileged person that would need to make the change, so that way the local host is going to be able to have that change. So mandatory is a little bit more restricted compared to your roaming user profile, where the roaming user profile has more option in the local system updating back into the server, whereas the mandatory user profile, whatever that you set from the server, that's what the user gonna get. And then you have the temporary user profile, which is created when error occurs. So it loads the user profile, and so when they log off, the profile is then deleted. We kind of want to stay away from this from a security perspective, but you do have this option where it would have the temporary user profile. All that is going to track the type of success and fail events that occurs on the system. So, once they log off, right, that profile doesn't exist no longer, right? It's gonna be deleted from that particular system. But can you go and find that, right? You can probably go into the registry and be able to see that at some point it actually created the temporary user profile. So, so your user profile information is here. Now, if you're working with like the older Windows, and so Microsoft announced that if you don't update to Windows 10, right, eventually they're gonna stop supporting 7. I think they stopped supporting 7. But you do see companies that have application that's built for Windows 7. So and they haven't update the application for the OS. So sometimes that you would see some older system that's still around. Windows 8 is kind of like the lost Windows. It was mainly made for mobile devices, and then 10, and now you see 11. So from 10 to 11, it's gonna be almost very close. It's actually 10 dot something, right? That they call it Windows 11 upgrade. Okay, so your profile information, you can find that on page 1 near the end. Um, and so in the registry, if you do reg edit, you would be able to find this particular DAT file .dat. And NT user, because the OS uses NTFS, right? It creates this particular registry hide under the NTuser.dat. And it would be able to, and when you need to find the registry information, you would then go into the H key current user. So how do I access the registry? In Windows environment, you can simply use regedit, right? And if you have permissions to do that, so your user accounts would be under HKey current users, right? And then if you want information, in addition, you also can go into your users here. And what it does is it would give you the hive, and you would just then follow the trail for specific things. But now, when you look at it, make sure that you actually examine it from the image, not the system itself, because if you modify something in the registry, you modify the state of that system. So just be careful about this. And then you have the local machines, the security agent that I told you about, that will be stored as SAM, right? So once I'm logged into the account, and that account would have specific privilege, right, and permissions to access certain things. So the agent is loaded under SAM, under the security option there, as you can see. So SAM entail like, security. And then if you want software information, you would see that there. So if they install something on the system, then it would be like an application, it would be under software. If they modify something on the system, like for hardware settings, right, you would see that under the system information, under the local H key. Okay. Any question? Okay. So that would help us answer number 3. Where can you locate user profile? You would open up your registry and you can run regedit, or you can just search for registry editor in your Windows search bar of the image. And then you would find the ntuser.dat, which allows you to map to the HKey current user, so you can see that. And you would sometimes need to get into the subfolder to be able to see more information. Now, some software tool, like some of the forensic tools, it will be able to pull this for you. Not all the tools will have that component, but the tools that are made to be able to examine Windows system, you would see that it's able to also find information in the registry. So it will tell you the application that they install, when they installed it, because it actually check it through the registry. Okay. Any question? So you would see all your music, pictures, videos, and documents would be related to that account, right? This is default for Windows OS. Most of you know this, right? And even downloads. And so now the app data folder is where it would contain specific preferences. Like for example, I would have screensaver that turns on when it goes into, non-use for 30 minutes maybe, that will be different than another user. So your preferences is then gonna be under app data for the current Windows environment and from 7 and up. I think 7 is slightly different than 10 in how they store these directories, but you will be able to see. So if you have profile configurations, or specific profile or account related, you would see that under app data. And then for the roaming folder, for the roaming account, it is just gonna be a little bit more lengthy. So you have to go into app data and then you are gonna go into the roaming tab. So there's a folder called roaming, and then you're just gonna dive deeper. So it has 3 additional subfolders. So you're gonna go into Microsoft Windows, and then you have specific things like I might have a different start menu. I might have some recent apps or access information. I might have some shortcuts for my printer, so it has a little bit different category of, different type of profile for the environment to sync, because the server, it controls the resources through these directory, right? So whatever that they change, it's gonna then add to these folders, and then it's gonna sync that back into the server. So for example, if I allow cookies on my browser, right, that's gonna update, and it's gonna update through the cookies folder under the Microsoft Windows, and that's under the roaming profile. So it's slightly different than your regular local host profile or your local user profile. Now, if you look, the true difference is gonna be this directory local compared to roaming, right? So that's the true difference. If you follow the path, you do have like history. So your OS store internet history information along with cookies. But we also know that RAM also contains some information of such, right? But the OS is going to have internet files that's temporary, also browsing history. A lot of the things that will be related to how they use the operating system is going to track all of that. And everything that you can find it mostly in the profile information, or you can find it in Windows Registry. So SAN, the company, they teach a course called Windows Forensic, quite a bit of money. It's about $5,000, right? I used to have the textbook for that. I used to teach a course at another institution specifically for Windows Forensic. So you do see that, like, if you dive deeper into Windows OS Forensic, there's a lot of like little nitty gritty detail. But in general, I think the chapter gives you the overall, some of the highlights, the important things to look at. So it's good to know where everything is so you can find it quickly. Okay, so we know that we need to navigate to the app data, and normally this is hidden. So the way that you can get around that is if you put in the path in your file explorer, it's actually going to take you there, right? Sometime when you try to go through File Explorer, you might not see the app data and the additional subfolder. So what you can do is you can type out the path, and then you can, or you can copy and paste the path onto the top where the browsing bar for the Windows Explorer, which allows you to see. And then for the roaming user profile, we mentioned that you need to navigate to the roaming directory, and then you need to go to Microsoft and Windows. And then you have subsequent, like all the subfolders like cookie, browser history, favorites, templates, printers, network shortcuts, that kind of stuff you're gonna see underneath. But the main point is to get from here, right, into all the subfolder. Okay, so that will be, and you can find that also from the notes. So if the user is using multiple browser and you see that a lot, like let's say I'm using Chrome and Edge, and I would add, right, different things to the favorites, it will also break that into the browser favorites. So when we get to browser and email chapter, we will talk more about that, but the profile itself, you can see that you can navigate to the directory there. Okay, so you can find the roaming information here, also the local. And for the temporary files, right, we would see that that will be more related to maybe internet browsing and also temporary internet files. So if you want to find information at the low level for low access data, you need to go to the local low folder. And this is gonna give you information for temporary files of the browser that might be in protected mode. So in all operating system, there is two modes. Some operating system call it system mode and a user mode. I don't know if you took CIS-21, right? I used to teach operating system class for computer science and IT. So slightly different. In IT, we configure OS. In computer science, they learn the structure of OS and building OS. So when you create an OS, there's going to be two modes. One is going to be protected mode or system mode. This is what you see when you're looking at permissions, when you know how system have full access to some of your files. Malware, a lot of times they write to access with protective mode, right? Ideally, your system should be able to prevent that from happening, but it doesn't always is the case. Now the user mode is what you can see, right? Like the folders, the objects, the components on the OS that you can control. So the protected mode is more for the layer between the software accessing the hardware, because the operating system is a way that we can control the hardware on our computer, like storage, right? Like your drive, like RAM, right? Like for your applications, and so on. So at the low level is still gonna have some of your data, because ultimately the OS has to pass it into the protected mode, and that protected mode is then gonna then interpret it for the instruction to be able to execute it with your hardware. Even with processing, right? Like, so if you think about malware, the executable for malware in Windows environment, it needs to have full access to be able to control things like, if you're looking at rootkit, right? It might be like overtaking the memory, or it's so rootkit access everything at the highest level, right? Sometimes it would also rewrite some of the things, or even when you're looking at ransomware, where it encrypts, right? So in order to encrypt outside of the software level, it might be also accessing it at the low access level. So, so if you want to do forensic for the protected mode, you have to go to local low, and you have to have the privilege to be able to access this, right? So system as an account in your system has full access to everything, okay? And you can see that in your folders property, like if you go to C Windows, right? If you look at System 32 folder, if you right click and look at the properties, system as an account really represents how it controls like the resources in the OS, right, for the lower level itself. Okay. Let's take 5 down. Okay, so we talk about the local low folder for number 6. Where can you find the low level access temporary files? We can go to local low folder. And in Windows 7 or 10, where can you locate the user password and security information? It's under the security hive. So I showed you regedit, right? Current user is there. Okay. So it tells you that if you go into your system root, system32 config and in the security hive. So you have to go into your system and then system32 under config and under the security hive. So in the security hive, you would see that would pertain to how the account is accessed with username and password. Now, let's say that you cannot find it there. A lot of times you can also find it with RAM. But this talks about like the account to log on to Windows, right? But if you have application password and account, that has to be in RAM because it loads to RAM when it runs the app. Okay, for question 8, it says in Windows 7 and 10, where can you find user access control? So your UAC pertains to how we can, like your permissions on your folder, or privilege. Like for example, I cannot shut down the computer or change the system clock, right? Like on your PC right now, if you try to change your system clock, you can't, right? Because you have privilege to do that. So how does it track this information? Remember that your account is tied to a security agent, and that security agent really tells the system what you're allowed to do, right? For that particular system. So user access control really pertains to the permissions that you have, like for application folders. So those are the objects, and then also the system itself. So you can find a file called usrclass.dat, and you can locate this right in the local system if you follow the app data path that we talked about before under local, under Microsoft Windows folder, and you can look at this file to be able to analyze and see what kind of permission they have. Okay. All right. So Sam, as I mentioned, that's your security account manager. This contains your login information, and under the security hive next to Sam, you will find your password information. But you know that Microsoft uses encryption to protect the password or the shadow password, so that's how it's stored, right? So later on in the text, you're gonna see that the notes, you're gonna see that they mentioned that, you know, if you cannot locate password, which likely happens, you would need to be able to crack the password. So you have to come with some additional tools to be able to crack your password. One of the things that I like to use is I use some bootable drive to be able to actually boot. So it creates a virtual machine and it boots the image. So at the login, you can actually just reset the password to access it, or you can go and try to retrieve it. And it doesn't really take up a lot of resources when you do that. So you can have multiple tools to be able to access it. Okay, so it talks about USR class.dat file there, and UAC information is on page 3. Okay, so you would see something like this. There's a screenshot. Okay, so we talked about a lot of these registry file, right? But when you find it, if you double click the file, it's gonna tell you like what kind of application do you want to use to open the file. So some of the tool that you can use is Regripper, it's gonna allow you to also pull information from registry and then parse it into text or XML file, which is great because when you deal with many accounts, it's gonna actually put it into an XML file similar to what you see when in Excel. So that way you can actually look at specific things for each account. And I put some information from for your GitHub. Eric Zimmerman also have some resources for you to be able to use it on Windows artifacts, and it is open source. Now, SANS, they are a big company. They also, do security along with teaching security and providing some education resources. So for the community, they share that you can obtain these type of artifacts for your Windows system. Okay. So that will help us answer the next question. So you can refer to the bottom of page 3. I can't talk today. Right. So when examining artifacts in the user profile, what type of artifact should you analyze? 1, you should look at account usage. A lot of this would also allows us to see in event viewer. That's gonna show you like the type of resource the user used, the service they use. So the logs for the account, right? And then going to the registry information, that's going to help you look at the account usage. We just talked a lot about that. And then you need to obtain file knowledge. We've been doing this. So when you file carve, remember we did a couple weeks back when we did the NTFS file carving. So you create an image and then you'll be able to carve it. So you can go and look at your boot sector and all of the address location on that storage and to be able to navigate through and see if your forensic toolkit will give you file information. Physical location, that can also pertain to geolocation. A lot of people now, the new Windows require that you log on to the online account. So they usually connect to an internet through the service provider. They would, when Microsoft actually narrow down on where you are on Earth, right? And then sometimes people actually share locations so that way they can get weather, news information, and so on. So that's going to help you with the physical location. And then program execution. So this can go from the program logs. You can find some information in registry for this. You can also look at RAM. We'll take a look at that down the line. We will be able to find more information. That's if the system is still running. So we can analyze the RAM for that. And then if they're using drive or USB drive, or additional storage. So these drives then can be analyzed with just like what we've seen with file carving and also drive analysis for the file system. And then browser usage. This comes back to registry and also the application. So we'll have a whole chapter on browser. Okay, so using the registry viewer tool, where can you find when the user last logged in, right? So you can go into C, Windows System 32, Config, SAM, Domains, User Account. And this is if they are logged onto a domain and then the users, right? But if you're looking at only the account on that system that's not a network system, then you can go into the local user like what we talked about before. Okay, so it would show you, right, the account information on they last log in. So that's under your security agent manager. So if you can get to SAM, you'll be able to find more information about that particular account. That's the point. Now, to look at logs, you can go through Event Viewer, but the shortcut for this is it stores everything under the logs folder under Win Event Viewer, right? This is Win event, and it's under the System32 folder. Some of these folders, if you try to navigate it manually, normally they are hidden. So sometimes it's, like I said, better to type in the path and it will take you there. Okay, so how do I read the logs? Anybody know? So if I get the log file, like I know Linux, it will be like .log, right? But Windows, it has the event viewer log. So how can I parse it to read it without using event viewer? All logs are text. So if you use text editor, right, like Notepad, Nano, things like that. So as long as you save it into a text format, you'll be able to read it. Even .log, you can parse it and read it as a text file for most part. Now, some software will give you, like I said, an XML file, which is nice. Then you have to use something to be able to read an XML, like if you use Excel or other type of tools to be able to parse XML content. Okay, so here it shows you how Regripper works. It looks similar to what you see in Windows environment. So if you install it and you run it on the image, you'll be able to see, right? And it also gives you the UI, which is kind of nice. It's similar to what you've seen with ProDiscover or Autopsy. But it tells you the address location, where it is in the registry. It's specifically made for registry. So, and then you can select the option. So this is what it would look like when you are pulling it from registry to obtain an account. So it'll give you the username, right? The SID is really tied to the security agent. It uses this identifier to be able to, load your account access. Um, and then it also have like, how people create password hint. It shows you when they last access. And then how many times they log on to the system, which is nice, right? And then it also gives you things, all the settings that's related to the password. And then when the account was created as well. Okay. So it also shows you what the SID looks like, or the SID. So the S in the front tells you that it's an SID, right? The number is the version, so you can look at this image. It looks at identifier authority, domain, or local. So this number right here, it's broken into two parts. So it's going to be which area, right? And then also which system to be accessed. And then your relative ID is the last part. So if you go and read this information, right, it gives you the breakdown information for that. So the thing that the author note is, if you don't see the 1001 or 1004 in the last RID here, right, that means that the account has been removed. Okay, so it would have a range of value there. Normally you would see 1001 there, or 1004 there, right? Or 1003. So in this range, then that means that the account exists and it's accessible. But if you don't see that value there, then that means that the account has been removed. Could be on purpose. Okay. So how can you locate information about remote desktop protocol or your RDP when a user system is remotely accessed? So for example, someone can connect to the internet and then access their computer at work, right? As long as they can authenticate to that domain. So they would have a remote access account and be able to do that. So when you're looking at the ID, look at the event ID, you would focus on the higher range in the security logs, and normally it's from 4,778 and above. That's gonna tell you because remote access is in that area. So when you look at the security logs, just scroll down and look at this section of it to see if there's entry in the log. So if there's entry in the log or under the event ID, then you have the remote user account. Any question? And sometimes that can be someone impersonating them too, right? In the case if you're investigating a breach event, right? Like maybe somebody log in with an employee account to be able to access certain application, to steal data, etc. So as we know, in Event Viewer, you have system application and security. And in regular system, you can just search for Event Viewer, and this also exists in Window Management Console and other areas, right? So if you look, you have the Windows log here, and this is what they're talking about, application security. And then there's some configuration under setup and system. So this is a little bit different than your Windows 7, right? On 10 and 11, they added some information, additional details there. And then your application, so it will pertain to more software level, and then also subscriptions. But Event Viewer, you can also navigate to specific area, like see how I have errors here, you can see, or security here. So it depends on the audit. So my system right now only audit success. Instead of both, right? It's gonna save the logs for these. And remote desktop protocol information is on page 6. Now it tells you here that if you look at a certain entry, you can see if they're logged in remotely successfully. So like my system, it would show a successful audit, right? On Event Viewer. Okay. And 13, what is thumb cache in Windows operating system, and why is it useful to examine the artifact? So thumbnail images that creates in that you can see, like the little icon that you can see, like let's say you're looking at all the pictures, right? You would see these little thumbnail icons that is stored as thumb cache. Forensic Toolkit application does really well in pulling thumb cache. It might not be able to give you all the pictures if the pictures have been overwritten, but it might be able to give you some of the thumbnail images that's related to that particular picture or file. Okay. Now we would be able to use it to really look at like the type of files that would be stored on that image, or even especially pictures or videos that's related to your investigation. Okay, so thumb cache is under the file knowledge section, right? This is when we would use the thumb cache information for file carving or to discover file related artifacts. And you can look at specific thumb cache information under App Data, Local, Microsoft Windows, and Explorer. There is an app called Thumb Cache Viewer. You can find that. I put the GitHub repository information, so you can use that as a tool. So for the search indexing database, you can find it under search and data application windows. So if you can use this to go through the thumbnails or how it's used to go through the thumbnail, and you can find that under this path. Okay, so which files is stored recently accessed or used files? So we saw in forensic access, modify, and create, right? We talked about that time last time. And ntuser.dat file actually contains the information for your files that is recently accessed. The forensic toolkit, if it carves out the file, it's going to tell you and it's going to give you the timeline. We touch on that. But in the system, the Windows system itself, you can find the information under ntuser.dat. So if the user deletes the file and you have a similar question every chapter, right? It is a common thing. You have to carve out stuff that is deleted. So when the user deletes the file, the original files gets renamed. And we remember that it puts the little symbol in the front to indicate that that is available. The address for that file is now available for the next file. So when you press delete, it goes into the recycle bin and it changes the file name. It adds the symbol to the file name. So it renames it, it puts the $sign in the R and then some random number, right? Alphanumeric value to the file name. So that way it knows that it is a deleting file. The file extension remains the same. So when the system create a second file, it's then going to start with a $and an I in the front, and it's going to use the same numeric characters that was used in the previous rename. Then the $I file is then have the same file extension as the R. So basically, it creates two additional versions of the file. One has the $ and the R in the front with the alphanumeric. Two, the second file, it's going to have the $I in the front, same alphanumeric value. And so this is how your Windows system distinguishes between your original file and the files that's in the recycle bin, which is now, right, the address space becomes available. It gets into the slack space, so that way the system can reuse that address or that storage location for new files. So we have to understand the deletion process to really trace back the step. So if someone deleted a file, if it's in the recycle bin, this is what it looks like, right? But once they empty the recycle bin, if that location is not being used by another file yet, right, your forensic toolkit application might be able to pull it. Likely it will, and then you'll be able to see it, but like it would contain some information that it was deleted, like what we see here for Windows system. Okay, so for the people who love shortcuts on their desktop, right? If they create a shortcut link, for example, to an application, to a file, to a network drive, whatever it is, it creates a file for that link. Okay, so every time someone double click that icon on their desktop, the shortcut, right? It's then gonna update that information. So the link files is then getting modified and updated over time. And it would be found, right? For the roaming account, it will be found under the roaming folder, right? Microsoft Windows, and it would be in the recent folder. So you would follow that to the recent folder, and it would tell you the information about their shortcut access. Because you might have a case where you have to also include this information, right? Like so and so use the shortcut on this date at this time to be able to do something, right? To be able to access the financial application, to move some money, whatever it is, then you have to be able to show that in your report. So you have to find the information from link files. Any questions? So let's go this up a little. So jump list is a way that Microsoft can pin recently used files to your File Explorer and your taskbar, right? I'm going to show you an example. Here's my File Explorer. If you see the quick access information, you see how I regularly access these folders, the files in the folder. So it is a way that I can jump to a directory or a folder that contains my file. So starting with Windows 7 use a thing called jump list, and it allows the user to access frequently used or recently used files from your Windows taskbar. Now, even if the user cleared the recent folder, it will not clear the information that's stored on the jump list. This is something that Microsoft used to track your usage for the OS. So, and as you open the file, it creates the logs, right? The logs get up, it updates the jump list. So if you use the same file 100 times recently, right, it's gonna be added to the jump list. So to be a better investigator for specific OS, right, you have to really understanding the components of the OS. Like learning or taking an OS class is gonna probably be helpful. You might be investigating Windows or Linux systems. So the more knowledgeable you are in specific OS, I think the easier it is to really navigate and understand where everything's gonna be. And some of this can also be built with experience where you don't have to take the class. So if you regularly use it, you know where everything is, right? And Microsoft does provide a lot of free resources like documentation for their operating system through their website. So you can also find information as well. Okay. All right, so the bottom part of 6 going to 7, it talks about different browser that's default in Windows environment, Internet Explorer is long gone, right? You know that now you cannot use it. You have to install Edge. So starting with Windows 10, I think 7 was when it last died. IE was full of problems, right, for security. But Edge is similar to IE. It actually is an integration of IE in a different app. So what you see is you do see some history information, but in the case, if you are investigating Windows 7 or older systems, right, you would see all of the history. So this is where the browser history lives, okay, in Internet Explorer. And then all the temporary file, the web cache dash, or the web cache.dat, all the storage that's buffered to your system, that exists here for version 10 and 11. I think that was when it was left off with Windows 7. And when you use the .dat file, right, for ESE database, like for your browser, you should download their viewer, right? This is, you can access it. I put a link for you here. So ESE database view container table. If you use like X-Way or other forensic tool, it already has this built in. So you should be able to find the information from your image directly using that tool. But in the case you don't, you can go to the link there. Okay, and then your recently used ntuser.dat. So that's really the key, right? For specific user, that's the file that you need to find. Recycle bin information. And then your link file is going to be .lnk for your link file. So it has like file property information, the location of the file, right? Where it's stored on the disk or in the volume. And then the MAC times, we already know what that is, right? Modify, access, create. And the file name. Your jump list information. So here, I didn't include this on your assignment. It talks about shell bags, and it's interesting because you can use it to really find information on how the user interact with the OS. So for example, if I'm gonna connect to, I double click my network drive, right, or use a network device or USB, it also update the information. We talked about this in other file, but shell bags is also a way that we can find information on how the user access. And so it also will also contain usr.class.dat or usr-class.dat information. And if you have other forensic tool, it actually contains the shell bags which access user class.dat file for Windows system. So you can find Eric Zimmerman's, and if you go to his repository, he has a bunch of really cool tools. You can find Shellbag Explorer, so that way you can download and use it outside of using the commercial tool. Okay, so prefetch just means that it's gonna preload some of the things that the user normally access or use to the RAM for the application, so that way it can quickly respond as you read that there, right? So the prefetch file really tells you about commonly used things, their preference information. For example, like, you know, at the start of my system, I might have services that are running or my account to access certain things. So you can find that under the prefetch, under the Windows directory, and it would have a .pf extension, okay? Now it might contain other executable information because everything that's performing as an executable or with processes, right? Microsoft use exe. Sometimes that, if you do install or something, that might be under MSI, but everything mostly would be under exe for application. So you might find some information about that at the prefetch. And to really read it, you should use Nearsoft, right? I play with this a little bit. I don't remember if I actually added to the lab, but so you can use Win Prefetch View tool, and you can go to the website and download and be able to access it. But like we mentioned before, Forensic Toolkit might already have that as well. Okay, so why do investigators examine prefetch in Windows system? To obtain the list of files that are used by executable, which are applications, and the number of times that it's ran, how it was or when it was last used. Okay, because if I'm using a file like a document, I would likely use Microsoft Word in Windows system, right? And that's an executable. Or let's say I'm using the browser a lot, like Chrome EXE is gonna run. So that will have already added to the prefetch, because if I use Chrome regularly compared to Edge, right, it will be in the prefetch. So where can you locate the information about network access history in Windows? You can go to the adapter, which is here. Okay, so we can navigate to Microsoft under the program data, and then under WLAN service, that means for your internet access, under the profile, and then in the interfaces, because like my laptop, I would have multiple interfaces. I might have a network adapter and a wireless adapter. So it would categorize that under two interfaces. But if you have a desktop that only have a network adapter, it will only be under that adapter profile. Okay, so you can see when they last access, and this is how they kind of see, like, oh, when so and so use the browser to look for murder weapon, right, or access the internet to search for things. And on the mobile devices, you're gonna have something similar through its OS, right? All operating systems have a way to log and track. Now your devices are probably tracking more data than right? We know that. So yeah.
When you hear somebody don't their computer go out, can you still get some data?
Yes. If the computer is not connected while it's done, right? Like a laptop's turn on when they drop it into the water, likely it's going to be shorted. It will kill the board and the processor. Water is a universal fluid. If you dry it completely, a lot of the times you can reuse the device.
If somebody was probably running some legal stuff and then they just close the laptop
and throw it, yeah, sometimes it shorts the device that are connected in it. So that can probably damage a lot, but a lot of the times, drive is interesting because if you have a lab that's able to take the drive apart and they have the machine to read the drive, then they can, right? But in some cases, yeah, like that, it will probably short out the device because it's integrated circuits. Once you have the short, right, it might kill the entire system. But in my experience, even fire extinguisher pour down on the computer while it's on. In some cases, you can, if it dries completely, you can still turn it on. Case in point, Makerspace, right? We had flood there twice, right? Half of the system, most of them were on, but half of the system died and the other half survived. So it kind of also depends on how they sealed the cases and the case components and all all of the other things. So you can't say that it's 100% gone, you know, so yeah, you have to take everything apart and then dry it completely and then put everything back. But you can use, you know, some kind of meter to test electronics to see if you get signal. Now, when you put something back, if the motherboard is short, then you have to find some motherboard to plug it in. But if we can get the drive out, we just get a drive reader and read it, right?
I saw a scenery, a movie, some cyber attacking stuff, and the cops are pulling up and they ended up taking the hard drive and just put it in the microwave.
Yeah, microwave normally the best way is probably magnets, right? Magnets usually kill data pretty quick. So yeah, unless you want to blow up your microwave and blow up the building with it, because some microwave is really high voltage, right? Metal inside the microwave is going to create short, right? So, but if you have high magnetic devices, you can apply magnetic devices to the drive without blowing up something. Yeah, that will also kill data, especially on the hard drive because it's magnetic oriented. So two magnets together, right? It creates it's zero out. So yeah, the movies they always make it seem like it's easy, right? Like, but if any, I don't recommend you trying putting things into the microwave unless you want to blow up the microwave and get hurt. So, but yeah, it's the glorified version of Hollywood is sometimes the case. And then it talks about shim cache, which is used to track compatibility issues for executable programs. You know how sometimes if you create a Word document in like an older version and then you're using a new version, like a new app to open it up, and it tells you it should convert it, right? So shim cache does that. It actually tracks like which version of software was created for the file and which version of the software you're using now. Is there a compatibility? Normally, we have forward compatibility, right? And some software will have backward compatibility. Not all software does, but this is the location where it would track back. And that is all she wrote. But so it also gives you more detail, like time zone information. We might need that for the physical location. And then I talk about you know, connecting to your internet, your WLAN, and how you can find, but you can also find user assist information. And this is in ntuser.bat file, right? Shim cache is located under System, Current Control Set, Control Session Manager, and App Compat Cache. It might not be called shim cache in the registry directory, but it is what Microsoft called the location for it to track compatibility and execution for application. Okay. And then your USB devices, it's in a specific location under enum. Okay. So if they ever connected the USB, that's crazy, right? Because most USB have firmware and it autoplays and all of that is logged. So you can find the USB information there. But you can also look at USB store under enum. So it might break it into two folder. Okay. And that's under the system hive. Okay. So let's come back to this. And I'm gonna end this so